Hello and welcome to the BALLE podcast. This is Andrew Connor, and I'm joined today by Christine Hanna, co-director of the Seattle Good Business Network, an economic development commissioner for the city of Seattle, and a 2013-2014 BALLE Local Economy Fellow. Christine, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Andrew.
So I want to start off by talking a little bit about your personal path to where you're at right now. You got an MBA, you worked in marketing, you worked at a think tank, you started businesses. You obviously are very passionate about all this work surrounding sustainable local businesses and local economies. How did you end up in this position running a network of businesses and organizations rather than just pursuing work as a business owner or running a business itself?
That is a great question. I was just before this interview, I was sitting in a local spot that's sort of a cross between a little mini grocery store and a cafe, and it's run by a couple of women. And I was just watching them work and trying to think of what their daily life was like, and asking myself that very question, or reflecting on that question. I have. My whole life has been kind of a systems thinker and an organizer and a connector and an entrepreneur at heart. And over the years in my work, I've done both. I have had small businesses, and then I've also worked for organizations that were bringing people together to serve some greater good. And what attracts me to the work of network building is that, first of all, each of these individual entrepreneurs and people who are running small local businesses, they are pursuing their passion. They are sort of trying to live their dream and are connected with their community and building relationships every day, and they thrive on those relationships that they're building with their customers. And yet oftentimes they feel quite isolated because they're not necessarily in camaraderie with their peers, i.e. they're the other people who are sort of slugging it out at the local level, trying to create a great local economy. And so part of what's so satisfying about having a network and running programs and initiatives and connecting people is that is sharing in that satisfaction that they have in connecting with those people, and knowing that we're sort of adding a little extra juice and joy into the lives of the people who are making our community so great. And so that's really satisfying for me. And it also kind of scratches my entrepreneurial itch, because I get to hang out with them, and I get sort of a little piece of the pride that each one of them feels in building that business. I get to have just a little bit of that, but for a whole lot of businesses. And so that way it kind of scratches my own personal itch to have my own business.
So what's the bigger impact then of that kind of networking work? I mean, it sounds, and I feel like I've seen this plenty, where that sort of connecting with other businesses, connecting with the local business community often falls to the bottom of the to-do list for those extremely overextended and busy entrepreneurs. So clearly there's a majorly satisfying element of it there. But what's the bigger picture component of how it actually contributes to a transformation of the economy itself?
Well, I think that the more that I do this work, the more that I realize that it's the collective, or the aggregation of these sort of individual experiences that, when they are aggregated, they create something much larger, and sort of there's sort of this halo effect that happens. When you come to a place like Seattle, and in each of these individual neighborhoods where many of them do have vibrant business districts, and they have a distinct feel to them, and people feel very connected to their neighborhoods, and they love where they live. And then you go to other places that don't have that, and the people who live there, they're sort of just, they're kind of just dialing it in. They live there because it was, close to a job, or there was or it was cheaper, or whatever it was that helped them make that decision. But it wasn't because they really wanted to be there. And the people who live in the neighborhoods in Seattle, they want to be there because there is this sense of there's a strong identity. They have these individual personal connections, And so you add all that up, and you end up with this feeling of community and connectedness that is unlike, I think, what most people experience on a day-to-day basis. And that's in addition to the very concrete economic benefits of keeping the dollars local and the multiplier effect and the impacts that these healthy local businesses have on our environment and our schools and our tax base and all of those sort of quantifiable pieces of so when you add all of those things up, you basically are creating a setting where everybody can have a meaningful stake in their local economy. And if we think of the economy as in service to community, which we certainly do, and I know that BALLE in general does, that we really can see that the only way to get to resilient, prosperous, joyful communities is if we have a strong local economy that more and more people have that meaningful stake in.
Right. How many members do you have? And do you know off the top of your head how many employees they represent, or sort of what the quantity is there? Is that a figure that you've got off the top of your head?
No, on the latter, but I could make an educated guess on that. As far as members go, the way that we're structured, we have a number of programs that businesses participate in on a regular basis, and then we have both businesses and individuals that pay us a monthly membership dues, and those are sort of our stalwart people who just they're very sort of rah-rah. But we don't, membership for us is kind of a what's the word I'm looking for? It's a hard number to get you specifically. We work with about, on an annual basis, we work with anywhere from 250 to probably next year we'll be working with somewhere in the neighborhood of 500 businesses on specific programs that they're directly engaged with. But we don't sort of push a membership base, and people don't have to be a member to participate in our program.
Right. Well, it seems like that level of involvement would reflect a pretty meaningful share of the Seattle economy.
Yeah, it would. And many of these businesses are small. I was looking at some data recently, specifically for manufacturing companies, because that's a program that's in development for us right now. Companies that manufacture and produce in the city of Seattle, and a good 85% of them have 20 employees or less. And 40% of them have 5 employees or less. So we're looking at, the great majority of them are really quite small businesses.
Right. But in the aggregate, that's a powerful.
Yes,
like you're saying.
Absolutely, it is.
Yeah.
Absolutely, which is often why, and as we've done this sort of grassroots economic development work, we see that part of the reason that this work can be so challenging is because it's difficult to put a number on what's the aggregate benefit of these businesses to our community, because when people think about them who are in sort of the economic development sphere or in a position where they have to allocate resources toward, do we work on, making these 5 companies that each employ 1,000 people really happy, or do we work on making these, 1,000 companies that each employ 5 people really happy? From a strictly sort of economic development numbers standpoint, if you're looking at it that way, sometimes those numbers look hard to reconcile.
Right.
And so part of our role is to say, okay, look at what's happening on aggregate here, and what are all of the important vital benefits that these individual small companies contribute to some of the non-tangibles, but the things that really contribute to quality of life and is why people want to be here. That's part of the role that we play in the community. In fact, I'm on the Seattle's Economic Development Commission, and part of my job there is to represent that sector of the economy and to make sure that there's a voice there when it comes to the city making decisions about how it's going to allocate resources or develop programs or policies.
Yeah, what is the Commission's receptivity to the localist perspective that you bring to what I assume is a fairly traditional organization?
one hand, it really depends on sort of, it's interesting, people often have kind of their professional, lens and then their personal lens. And when we start talking about, we start talking about local businesses and people start talking about their own personal experiences, everybody has a favorite local business, and
Right.
usually many of them, right? And at the same time, they're also a lot of their shopping on Amazon. They're very happy when our publicly traded companies do really well, and so it's not black and white at the big picture level or at the individual level. It's a complicated question, but I would say that for those that share these values or at least share the ideals at some level, they're very happy that I'm there because I can easily speak to these values and hold that position, whereas they often are in a situation where it's harder for them to voice that because of their professional role. And so I provide an outlet for that, and so I think that there's quite a bit of appreciation for that, even if they're not necessarily verbally supportive in the moment.
So they kind of count on you to push that edge when they're not able to give that voice.
When they're not able to. That's right. That's right. It's like any, in always it's like any sort of advocacy work. The people who are working for something in the middle count on the people who are on the edge to provide that to be pulling,
right.
and provide that cover. Mm-hmm.
So speaking of Seattle, I assume that anybody who's coming from almost anywhere else in the country would listen to you talk about the work that's happening in Seattle, that you're doing in Seattle, and look at the website that Seattle Good Business Network has and think that, well, sure, in Seattle, with the cultural values and the politics, like it must be like falling off a log in Seattle, and just the assumption being that it's really easy there versus other places. I'm curious, how you would respond to that in general, and then maybe specifically if there's anything that you would think of that is actually more difficult to do in Seattle than elsewhere with regards to this work.
Yeah, that's a great question. I can see why people would say that, because we are sort of seen as progressive and independent and, a little bit off the wall sometimes. And certainly compared to a lot of places in the country, that's absolutely true. And yet, when you're talking specifically about sort of localization efforts, there are a number of challenges here in Seattle. For one, compared to a lot of places in the country, our economy is relatively strong. And so, and that again, this is all sort of looking at aggregate numbers. There are lots of individual places within Seattle where that is not the case, and there are a lot of individual people and groups of people in Seattle that are not doing well. And they're often, in fact, almost always left out of the conversation around how is Seattle doing. So, again, that's often sort of part of our job is to remind people that, when people say, oh, well, now the economy is recovered, then we don't have to worry about X anymore. And I have to remind people that say, it's recovered for some people. It hasn't recovered for a lot of people. But we have, so going back to this question about localization efforts, we have Amazon here, we have Starbucks here, we have Boeing here, and then we have a number of other, large, well-known companies that are based out of this area as well. But those three in particular provide kind of interesting case studies. Amazon, I think, is a great example. Amazon, for many people who work in local economic development, especially looking at neighborhood retail, has just been an absolute killer as far as making those small businesses, making it really difficult for those small businesses to stay in business. And yet they are here. Amazon is here in Seattle. They employ a lot of people. Everybody knows somebody who works on Amazon if they're not working for them themselves. And they are right here in the city of Seattle. There's a neighborhood called South Lake Union that's just north of downtown that has I don't know how many thousands of Amazon workers are there now. So it provides a sort of interesting discussion around what does it mean to localize, and there's always but what about Amazon? Shouldn't we love Amazon? And now you're saying that Amazon is bad, right? So that's a challenge in doing localization work in the place where Amazon lives. Starbucks is another very interesting case. Here you've got a global company that in a lot of ways started the independent coffee culture in the United States. They are, by many accounts, really a fantastic company. I mean, many of their values are really in the right place, and they talk the walk, or they walk the talk. In fact, they just announced, I don't know if you ran across this, but they just announced that they are paying for their cafe workers to get a BA or a BS.
Go back to school, right?
Go back to school, and then they're paying for that tuition to make that happen because they recognize that that's not a career,
Right.
I mean, oh my goodness. I mean, what if that was the norm in our country,
Right.
Right. And the only way it could ever become the norm is if there are companies like Starbucks who step up and say this is important and we're going to make this happen. Right. So, at the same time, I mean, and I have to answer this question all the time. If I had a choice of where to place any, if we're going to get 5 new cafes in our city, and this could be for Seattle or any place, right? Would I rather those be Starbucks, or would I rather them be local independently owned? Absolutely, I want them to be local independently owned because the net benefit, just the total benefit, you're talking about community, you're talking about economic benefit, you're talking about identity, all of those things are going to be enhanced with the local independent coffee shop rather than the Starbucks. So I always say when people ask me, what about Starbucks, I say, if they're going to be headquartered anywhere, I want them to be headquartered in Seattle, because It's true. They provide a lot of fantastic jobs, and yet I don't really want to see another Starbucks in our town.
Right. One of the things that I find most interesting talking to people in different communities is that everyone seems to have this sort of different paradigm for how they conceptualize local, and what the contours of that are for them, or what their paradigm is for exactly considering what is or isn't, or what the shades of local are, or the sort of hierarchy of how they consider local. And so I'm wondering if you sort of have any kind of rules of thumb or ways that you break things down to say, like, this is the ideal, this is the next ring out, this is the next ring out, and this is this is definitively not. Do you have something that you sort of carry around in your head to do those sort of assessments with?
I do have a couple different frameworks that I use when we're thinking or talking about this, and it depends on kind of what the question is. So, for example, when somebody says to me, "Is Starbucks local?" and what I say is, well, Starbucks was founded here and is headquartered here, but they're no longer locally owned. They're owned by people and corporations and sort of legal entities worldwide, and what that means is that the decisions that they make are no longer that the primary driver is no longer how is this going to impact the community where we live, if it ever was, but if there was a chance for that to be a primary driver, that's no longer the primary driver for a company like Starbucks. And so, no, we would not classify them as local in the sense of local independent. We often say something along the lines of, it's as close to home as possible. So if somebody, when we're talking about, let's say a coffee roaster, we've got, I don't know how many. We probably have 40 coffee roasters in the city of Seattle. Every neighborhood has at least one company that's actually roasting coffee in their neighborhood.
True to the stereotype, right?
Yeah, right. And so if you're, I mean, you can talk about it that way. Like, well, I want to support the businesses that are in my neighborhood, and we have people, and this, back to your question about how people in Seattle can be kind of kooky. We have people in Seattle that are committed to doing as much as they possibly can in terms of their economic activity within their neighborhood, like within a 10-block radius of where they live. it's an amazing challenge, I think, that they're in for, but they do it because they really believe in it. So there's that. There are those examples, and then you say, okay, well, what about got a company that's making frying pans, and they happen to be in Spokane, Washington, which is about 400 miles away from here. Is that local? It's like, well, it's as close to home as possible. If I can get a really good frying pan from a company that's in Spokane, that's great.
Right.
Same thing with things that are made in the USA, as long as the quality is there and it's not exorbitantly expensive.
You take a pretty relative approach to.
We do. We take a pretty relative approach. When we're talking sort of theoretically, we take a very relative approach. Now that breaks down when you start talking about things like membership criteria. So when we formed as an organization, we had to make a decision about which companies could be a member or not. And it was relatively easy to say, okay, well, they have to be headquartered in Washington, or they have to be incorporated in Washington State, and the majority of the owners need to be here. But okay, so what is here? Well, we ended up deciding on a 4-county metro area around the city of Seattle, because we had so many people who, they might live outside the city, but their business is in the city, or their business is in the city, but they live outside the city, and it's a fluid boundary for people. Nobody else is thinking about things in these clear, except for map makers.
Right.
Nobody else thinks about it in these ways, right? But when you have to be able to say, yes or no to a question, we had to be able to put something there. And then we ended up expanding it for producers and manufacturers and farms. And this was several years ago, before we even started thinking about a program that was specifically for those, because we recognize that, there aren't, there are a handful of urban farms in Seattle, but for the most part, farmers are outside of Seattle, but most of their goods are being sold here in Seattle, and it's as close to home as we can get if you're looking for, whatever it is, bok choy or carrots or whatever. So there's that, and then there's a question, and I just got an email on this yesterday, which is why I'm thinking of it. I probably wouldn't have otherwise, at least in terms of our conversation. And that is, what about working with those companies like Amazon and Starbucks and Boeing and so forth in our localization efforts? Should they be engaged? To what degree? Or do we just sort of, if we have to be against them in any way, does that mean that we can't be with them in any way?
Right. I was actually speaking with someone at a network, and they talked about specifically, and it was in light of their discussion about membership criteria, and they were saying that they really struggled because they had chain stores at the mall that were carrying tons of locally made clothing and locally made products. So their impact on the local economy was really huge. And then they have a local oil change place, totally locally owned, but everything that they carry and all of their money going out was going to these sort of, mass manufactured products from abroad. And so sort of defying a little bit of that easy categorization, and them actually really appreciating some of those bigger chain stores that were willing to work on localization.
Absolutely. That is, and that's where you get into, there's the theory, and then there's the actual sort of application of it, and it breaks down all the time. It's not clear cut, and we run across examples like that constantly. And you can imagine in a metro area like Seattle, where there's a lot of diversity within a given sector of, say, the retail sector or the services sector, and depending on who's running those companies and where their values are and what their commitments are, they could be operating, we have a gym here that is so committed to the community, and there's a whole lot of, does a lot of things that are, everything that you would want a local independent business to be, except their franchise. And it's like, oh, brother, what do you do with that? Which I have to say, in some ways, is part of why we have struggled with this concept of membership, because we feel like if there is a company or a person who is trying to advance, we're all trying to advance the same goals, then to get hung up on certain labels or on certain facts or specifics about an individual business can kind of be counter to the bigger picture objective. And like this is a good example. We just recently have been in some conversations with Starbucks about the Seattle Made program. They started here. They used to roast here. They're actually going to be roasting here again here shortly. But the majority of their operation is global, and yet they're in a position where they could really support Seattle-made produced manufacturing because they have such an incredible presence in so many places here and elsewhere. And so, would we say no? We're not going to work with Starbucks because they're not local independent? Well, I feel like that would be sort of cutting off our nose to spite our face. Now, do we have to be really thoughtful how we affiliate and how that affiliation is presented, and so does Starbucks. I mean, they don't want to be seen as hypocritical, and we don't want to be seen as hypocritical. So how do we present kind of relationship and that kind of potential that makes sense, in this topical?
I'd like to talk a little bit about the programs that Seattle Good Business Network has going on. A couple of them in particular. Like so many local business networks, you have a Think Local campaign to encourage awareness and encourage consumers to patronize local businesses. And I noticed as I was looking through the materials on your website that it was referred to as a 3-year project, that it was time limited. Is that correct?
Well, it was a campaign that we ran for roughly 3 years. We didn't start out with the idea being that this would be a 3-year campaign. But we decided, because for a variety of reasons, to wind it down after about 3 years. And I can go into that, into what the reasons were if you want to.
Why was that? Please, I'd love to know.
Sure. Well, why don't I explain a little bit about what it was? It was actually the idea, the kernel of the idea was borrowed from Oakland. Many years ago, they had done this thing where they took photos of local independent businesses holding handwritten signs, some kind of fun, unique thing about the business that the business owner or the staff had written. And then we're running these photos in the East Bay Express, which is a weekly newspaper in Oakland. And we had run across that early on when we were first forming and thought, that's a really fun, it's a fun way to do a Think Local or a Buy Local campaign. And we ended up hooking up with a guy named Marty Griswold, who at the time was the head of sales and marketing for The Stranger, which is one of our major weekly papers here in Seattle. And he happened to be really good friends with the gal who ran the East Bay Express down in Oakland. And so he was really excited about doing something similar here in Seattle. So we cooked up this campaign along with, and we had kind of pulled together a little steering committee of local independent businesses to say, okay, well, if we were going to do something, what would we do? We, at the time, we faced a challenge that I think probably, any independent business network in a metropolitan area faces, and that is that there are lots of little buy local campaigns that have started and stopped, and there's neighborhood-based things. And in Seattle, we have something like 30 neighborhood business districts, and 2/3 of them have some kind of organization that helps promote businesses within the neighborhood, right? And so we really didn't want to be redundant and do what was sort of the typical elements of a Think Local campaign. And so for these partnerships with citywide media, we started doing this photo thing, and then we expanded it to, and so each business got a photo and they got to run their photo in the publication. So over the course of that three years, we ran about 100 full pages of these photos of these local businesses. So it was super fun, and we ended up doing a little bit of TV. We also, my favorite elements of the campaign was that we had a booth at major events, summer events in Seattle, and there was a backdrop that said, "My favorite local business is," and then the person would stand in front of the backdrop with a sign that they had written on that had the name of the business. And then we would print, and then they would write a little note to the business saying, we just love your almond gelato, it's the best in the city, keep up the great work, whatever it was.
Right.
And then we would print out the photos and send the photo with the card to the business. It was like this little sort of,
Thank you
unexpected love note,
Yeah.
little love note from, a favorite customer. And I can't tell you how many, emails and notes we got and, Facebook things from local businesses saying, oh my gosh, you just made my day. It was so sweet. It was so sweet. And those are on they're on our Facebook, albums on our Facebook page. We probably sent, I don't know, 800 or 1,000 of those over the course of a couple of summers.
Wow.
Really, really fun. And then we have an online directory and other materials and so forth. Anyway, that campaign, it was a sort of thing where we felt like, okay, either we either need to go and reach out and recruit a whole bunch of new businesses to participate in this, or we need to really change up the campaign entirely.
Just because you felt like it had run its course?
It had kind of run its course, exactly. It had kind of run its course. And the way that we knew that was because when we would reach out to businesses that were part of the campaign and say, okay, we've got, we're going to be running a page in the Labor Day edition of, this magazine, we had a schedule and we would run them. It got to the point where we were sort of pulling teeth to get businesses to run their photo again because they were paying each time, the media partner. And there was it was the first, the first initiative that we had run, and we learned a lot, obviously, as we are always learning, but we learned a lot in terms of how to structure things, and we had not structured that in a way where the ongoing participation by the businesses was really covering our costs of coordinating the campaign. And so the combination of it not covering course felt like, okay, either we need to like start fresh, or we just need to wrap it up. And we decided that that we were proud of what we'd done, and we were ready for something new to focus on. And like I said, it's not as though that's a message in Seattle that is. There's no real void there of that message. There are lots of neighborhood groups that are that are part of that same drumbeat as well. So we didn't feel like if we stopped the campaign that all of a sudden people would forget all about the importance of buying local.
So I'm interested, historically that kind of local first campaign has been basically a point of entry for people who are doing this kind of localist work anywhere around the country. Mm-hmm. Many BALLE networks, that's the first thing they did, or that's the only thing they do. And I'm wondering, the movement has been continually evolving, and I'm wondering if you still feel like, there's a certain logic to that as a first step in a community, but I'm wondering if you feel like that's still the right place for the average local business network to start, or if maybe there are alternatives that are emerging as better starting, more effective, more valuable starting places.
Oh boy, that is a great question. I don't know if I have an answer to that question specifically, but I have some thoughts in general on that topic. I would say that one of the so part of the reason that we started there, we actually didn't, when we first formed, this is kind of a little bit of interesting history. So I had been kind of following Sustainable Connections up in Bellingham for some time while I was at another nonprofit called Sightline Institute, which is a sustainability think tank, does regional work. But my background had been in economics, and I have an MBA and had my own, been in the for-profit sector, and so I was really interested in the work that Sustainable Connections was doing. But because of my training in economics and my MBA, I was really not a local first advocate at all. In fact, the first brief that I had written about starting something like this, it specifically said in there, this is not a local first organization. And my thinking on that is, obviously has evolved quite a bit. And I really do believe that local economic development is one of the few, if only, path we have toward the kind of society that we ultimately want. But part of that was we saw my angle and my entry point, my personal entry point. Everybody's got their own entry point into this field, was around sustainability. I felt like there was that businesses had a really important role to play in creating a sustainable society, and the focus was going to be on helping sustainable businesses and helping convert businesses that weren't sustainable into sustainable businesses, et cetera. And when we first went out to say, hey, this is our idea, what do you think? And we started gathering businesses together, it became very clear very early on that, two things became clear. One, there weren't going to be enough businesses to create a sustainable business network, A. There just weren't enough of them out there. And B, you had to show, you couldn't build a network just based on some good ideas. You had to show direct value. So what is that direct value going to be? What's something that a business is going to say, yes, I'm going to pay money for this particular thing, because otherwise it's just sort of like, well, that's interesting, I'll keep an eye on that. I'll see what happens. But
was it just that it felt like it was tapping their charitable impulse rather than their self-interest without that element?
Yeah, exactly. You couldn't. There was not going to be. When we in our first, I don't know what, 8 or 9 months as an organization, we did have probably, I don't know, maybe 30 or 40 businesses join, or individuals join as members. And they joined as members because they wanted to be part of a group of people, individuals who were, had the same vision, right? But the reality was, if you were to look at the profile of that group, it was the same people who had been sort of following BALLE, for a long time, and a lot of them, were, solo entrepreneurs. Somebody said the incense and candles crowd, just a little bit, right? Right. Which is not a major influence make in a major metropolitan area, right? Right. And so, if we wanted to break into sort of the mainstream local businesses, we had to provide some direct value, and that was where the origination of the Think Local campaign came about. And so when we went out to recruit businesses to participate in that, membership was a part of that fee. So you pay this fee, these are the things you get, and oh, by the way, you also get to become a member of Seattle Business Network, and isn't that great, because we care about X, Y, Z, and this is the kind of world we want to see, and we believe that you're a part of that. So that's where it originated, and I still very strongly believe that if somebody is of the mindset that they want to create a network of local businesses, you're not going to get anywhere unless you're providing some very concrete specific value to those businesses. And for most of that businesses, that means promotion. So if you go to them and say, well, we're going to help you be better community stewards, or we're going to help you be more sustainable, or we're going to help you do this, all of them want to do those things, but it's never going to be the first thing on their list.
Right.
It's not. And the only way they're going to start to listen to you about those things is if they already trust you as an organization that really does care about their survival and their thrival.
So it sounds to me like you're saying then that logic still holds true. That basically, unless there's another alternative for that value you provide them.
I think so that's sort of part A of the thinking and why we went about that. I don't know that if we were to start today, would we go about it in the same way? I'm not sure. I think that one thing that has become I'm not sure I would say it's become clear. The forces against independent retail are so strong. And in Seattle, we had another thing happen recently that is going to make it even more difficult for independent retail to survive. And in all of our neighborhoods, we're seeing independent retail close, and they're replaced by primarily food and restaurants and bars, right, for the most part. So when I think about where would you start, if you're looking to impact the local economy, there's lots of places where there's a lot of work to do, right? I mean, food is a big one. I do think the production is also a really big one as well. I think that there are arenas, capital, I think, is also a really important one. There are arenas where there's a lot of potential impact to have, and that don't have, that have their barriers, of course, but the trends aren't so against them that you sort of feel like it's a bit of a losing battle, you know. And I think if you were going to start someplace, that the place to start is to look at where is the place where we can have the most impact that coincides with a group of businesses who are hungry for that kind of help. So there has to be that. There has to be some coinciding there. Now there's a caveat there, and that is one thing about a Think Local campaign is that it raises awareness for the organization or the mission of the organization among the general population. And there's no question that when I go out and say, if I'm at a party or wherever I am, and I say I'm with Seattle Business Network, a lot of people don't know the name of our organization, but when I say, well, you might know us because we ran the Think Local campaign, and people will be like, oh, the ones with the signs, or we run Dine Around Seattle. Oh, I love Dine Around Seattle. Like, people know the work that we do, and if we hadn't been working on a campaign that was meant to be fairly high profile, then they wouldn't know about us, and it would be harder to go out and get funding and partnerships and conversations started with new folks.
So,
but I do wonder about the retail focus. If you're just getting started, I do wonder about it from just kind of a systems standpoint. And like I said, I don't have any conclusions about it. But if we were starting today and I had all the knowledge I have right now, I don't know that's where I would begin.
You mentioned production, and I'm actually interested in asking you about that too, because you are working on kicking off this Seattle Made program, which is an effort to support local manufacturing businesses in Seattle and subsequently brand those businesses with sort of a Seattle Made label. Correct?
That's right.
Accurate? Yeah. So I'm sort of curious. There's a notion, of course, about manufacturing jobs. There's an idea that manufacturing jobs are these sort of superior kind of jobs. They're inherently more higher paying, more stable. Is that just a vestige of the kind of industrial heyday of the high paying unionized factory work that was available in this country for the last half of the last century? Or is there really still a relevance there about that specific kind of work, those specific kind of businesses, and those specific kind of jobs that is really essential to a local economy?
I would say that there's a lot of variation within that statement. So to say that manufacturing jobs are better jobs, higher paying, it really depends on the industry and the size of business that dominates whatever the sector is. So I'll give you a couple of examples. We have some significant shipbuilding that happens here in Seattle. We've got we have waterway assets that are unique, and so it's a good place to build ships. And for those companies, you can get an entry-level position without a college degree, and within 5 years of doing a good job, you can be making 60 to 70K a year. So, and the population, the current workers in that sector are aging. I think the average age is something like 52 or something like that, and they're desperately trying to encourage young people to consider these jobs as a career path. And so there's a whole lot of back and forth discussion and who's thought about why don't we have more sort of training programs in the high schools and so forth. And there's this idea about it's funny, on the one hand there's this sort of meme out there about how manufacturing jobs are good high paying jobs, and on the other hand it's it's dirty, dead end, and dull, right? And so parents and schools are really push the idea of a 4-year college and different kinds of career paths other than manufacturing. So in any case, there are those jobs, and they are here in Seattle. And also, if in any business that really is in is doing a lot of production, if there's machinery and equipment involved, and all these machines are, getting they're quite technical.
Right.
So these are they're real steps. Now they're very specific to those sectors, and yes, they can be high paying if you're there for a little while. Then you have like sort of food production, or you have like in Seattle, we have, as I mentioned, the number of small businesses that are out there are a lot of small businesses, and a lot of them in certain sectors. So in food, there's just been an explosion, and I can tell you that those businesses are not making 60 or 70K a year in those businesses as a production worker, not even close. You're lucky to be, you're probably doing about as well as you are if you're in retail. So the question is there a way to, what's the role of those businesses in the long run? Is the goal to make sure that some percentage of them get large enough that they can support higher paying jobs? Or is it to create enough economy of scale by helping them band together to share resources and equipment and whatever the possibilities there are, so that they can be paying employees more? Or is it, of course, there's always the possibility that it's just a failed model, or that they'll get bought. The product line will be bought by another larger company, which is always a possibility as well. So there's a real mix.
Go ahead. Yeah.
That's all. It's a real mix, and it's not a. You have to be looking at the individual sectors and the kind of makeup of those sectors to be able to figure out what's actually going on.
The mystique is not necessarily uniformly true.
It's not uniformly true, but it's also not dead by any means. It's
right.
It's very, very true for a lot of manufacturing businesses. Yeah.
So what was Seattle Good Business Network's rationale behind starting the Seattle Made program, and what's the strategic choice as far as, of the kind of scenarios you outlined, like what are you pursuing?
Well, we had a number of producers who had been members at one point or another, or who had actually participated in the Think Local campaign or other things that we've done. And, again, many of them, I think in some ways just because of the nature of what they're doing, they're physically making a product or, working with material here in Seattle and selling something that they are by nature sort of localists.
Right.
And so from a values perspective, they wanted to be part of something like that, and yet the offerings the services that we were providing were really not a great fit for them and what they needed. And so it kind of, we would sort of hear this, this sort of popcorn of hey, you guys should do you guys should do something for us, or what about this? Have you seen this thing that people are doing in this other place? And so we started paying attention to what was going on around the country, and really became inspired in a lot of ways by SF Made in San Francisco, which is a pretty young organization. They've only been around about 4 years, about as long as we've been around, but have really their focus on supporting producers and manufacturers in the city of San Francisco and really elevating the visibility of and the voice of those businesses as a group in the discussion about what do we want our city to be, and what do we want it to look like, and what kind of jobs do we want to have here. And if you talk to any economic development person that I've talked with, at least publicly, will say we have to have good manufacturing production jobs in the city of Seattle. Now, the policies are not always aligned with that statement. There's a lot of pressure, of course, on land. There's pressure on wages. There's just a variety of things. But they will they'll stand behind it in words anyway until the cows come home. And so it's something that everybody says that they want, and yet there's not a lot of actual support or organization around supporting those businesses. And in Seattle, because we have a deep history in aerospace and also in maritime, whenever there is discussion around manufacturing in this area, it always is within the context of those two sectors. So we do have a couple of organizations in Seattle that support our maritime businesses, which are things like, as I mentioned, sort of shipbuilding, fishing, any kind of logistics. We have a port here. And so there's this whole group of businesses that are somewhat served by these organizations, although they primarily focus on policy and not on things like promotion or operations. But then there are at least 1,000, probably 1,500 other businesses that are producing here in the city of Seattle that have no connection to our maritime assets and are completely unorganized and unconnected and unsupported. And so when we realized that was the case and we started pulling together, having informal conversations with, we'd go to a local brewery and invite, 6 or 7 local producers, and then we'd go to some other place and invite 6 or 7 local producers. It was really clear that people were saying, yeah, this would help us a lot. I would love this. And even just in those meetings, the connections that were happening and the new businesses that was being developed and the information that was being exchanged was eye-opening. And that wasn't even the purpose of those meetings. The purpose was to say, here's what's going on in other places. Do you think we should do something like that here? So the demand was there. There are some good examples around the country, and the other economic development interests in this area are also very encouraging and want to see it happen as well. So all those things aligned, and we said, okay, we're going to clear the decks and see if we can make this happen. And as far as the who are we focused on? Are we focused on the big guys or the little guys, or what is it? The brand itself, Seattle Made, will be able to be used by any company that is physically making a product here in the city of Seattle. And if the company needs to be headquartered in Washington State, and the majority of the owners have to be in Washington State. So, and we've had lots of discussions about what those criteria are, and
Sure.
What are we losing out on, and what are we gaining by making those decisions. But there need to be some boundaries, and those are the boundaries that we've chosen. Now that said, there are going to be a lot of businesses that are not a lot. There are a handful of businesses that are very large that fit those criteria, and for those businesses, the way that they would participate is going to look different than a business that is 1 or 2 people and is has just gotten their 5th retail contract, or is now looking for new production space or whatever it is. Most of the services and the promotion opportunities are going to be most beneficial to those smaller businesses. And the goal, we have a number of sort of goal areas, but I would say, sort of broadly, we want to increase the success rate of those businesses. So reduce the failure rate, increase the success rate by providing both opportunities to increase revenue, so promotion and distribution opportunities, and then also to reduce their costs through support around operations and financing and all of those activities, whether it's on the revenue side or on the cost side, are really about relationships and bringing people together, bringing information together, making it, having all of that collective knowledge actually be in a place that everyone can benefit from. Because at the moment, everybody's trying to reinvent the wheel on their own, and it's very, very inefficient.
Right. Well, so speaking of production and a new sector that kind of spans production and retail and all these, agriculture, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about this, because I asked your fellow Nikki Langston at the Mile High Business Alliance about it when I interviewed her as well. But what have you seen so far on the impact of the local economy of the marijuana legalization and this kind of all of a sudden creation of this entire new industry, basically, in the state and in the city?
It is it's a whirlwind. I mean, in the last 2 years, you cannot drive down any busy street in Seattle and not see several medical marijuana dispensaries. So that was the first kind of wave. And there were all kinds of interesting issues around, what you are, lease space in a building, and there's this spot next to you opens up and the landlord decides to lease it to a dispensary, and now next thing you know, every time somebody walks into your office for a meeting, it smells like pot. There's all kinds of just interesting stuff like that's happening, and then we passed the law to decriminalize and make it legal to sell there were lots of gaps in that law in terms of what does that mean for growing, what does it mean for distribution, what does it mean for food products that contain marijuana. It's just a whole mess of stuff, and we're learning a lot, obviously, from Denver. What does it mean in terms of our local economy? I don't know yet. It's big. We know that. We know that it's still pretty messy, and we know that there are lots of murmurings and discussions around how do we keep this sector supporting our local economy in a strong way as possible, and not letting it get corrupted by global interests, because boy, it's ripe, right?
Yeah.
But as an organization, we've not been involved directly. This is all just from observation. As obviously we're thinking about it from the lens of a local economy, but we're not directly engaged at this point at all.
Still too early to say, huh?
Yep, I think it is. It's too early to say.
Right, well.
But I will say that there are, fortunately, and maybe the sector in general draws people who are somewhat more locally minded. I'm not sure about that, but it does seem to me that I often see that as part of the discussion, part of the conversation, or articles or whatever, people who are in the industry saying it's really important that we make sure that the benefits of this stay local, the economic benefits of it stay local. And so that's,
or maybe that's a byproduct of the work that you all have done.
I would certainly like to think so. I'd like to think so. I would. I do think that I don't know about that sector specifically, but maybe so. Certainly, people who read The Stranger are good candidates for that, and we certainly had a lot of messaging through The Stranger. So, yeah.
Well, that's great. The last question that I want to ask you is just sort of a general one about the current state of affairs in the localist movement, and I just sort of want to know your take on where you think the localist movement is kind of missing the boat. What needs to happen that isn't happening, generally speaking, in a widespread sense, in the localist movement? What's the biggest missed opportunity out there?
Well, I think there are two areas, maybe three areas. One is less an opportunity, but more of just kind of I'm not sure what it is. Okay, so the first is procurement. Both at the municipal level, but also with anchor institutions. I think that what they've done in Ohio, right, in Cleveland, really big opportunities there. I think in probably every city, and yet, but it requires such a heavy lift, and you have to have the right partners on board. That's probably what some of the barriers are, and yet I think that has the potential to raise awareness at a whole different level, because not only are you having significant impact within a given place in terms of economic impact, but you're also all of a sudden making all of those employees of those businesses, of those anchor institutions, much more aware of the basic sort of framework and formula for how do you grow a local economy. And once somebody starts thinking about this in a different way, then it shifts, even if it's just a little bit, it shifts all of their decisions, right?
You're speaking specifically of the procurement practices of large institutions?
Yes, of large, right. So we've talked about, sort of developing kind of a, localize it partnership where we get, a couple of the universities and, Starbucks and Costco and a couple of the hospitals to say, okay, we're gonna take a close look at our buying practices and see where we have discretion to switch vendors so that we are buying more from businesses that are based here, that are locally owned in Seattle, and and see what kind of, together what kind of impact you could have. And that it could be very sort of public effort. It could be like, okay, here's our goal. Yay, we made our goal. Isn't that awesome? And here are the new vendors. And I just think there's a whole lot of potential for something like that, both in terms of economic impact, but also in terms of raising awareness. That's not being done. And again, I think that part of it is because this movement in general has come from the fringe and is getting a foothold more and more places within more mainstream businesses and more mainstream policy making around that. But it's still not. It's not easy just to pick up the phone and get the heads of procurement of the top 5
right.
Businesses in your area or institutions in your area and say, let's do this thing. It takes a lot of relationship building and history and trust and so forth to get to that point. Or it needs to be driven by one of those companies or by a local foundation or something like that.
Right.
And we're not there yet, but I would say that we're headed there. That's where we'd like to go at some point.
Great. So procurement, one. What else?
Capital is another area as well. We just ran a series, 8-month event series around community capital that sort of showcased the different tools that are out there and available and starting to be played with and so forth. And it's enlightening. I mean, there's an incredible amount of stuff that's going on. So and yet if you could scale it up, it would have a major impact. But it's not clear what the next steps are. So there's lots of these little interesting, how do you sort of pull it together, a bigger impact for more companies, more people. So that's the second thing. And then the third thing goes back to this question about retail. I am somewhat eager to have kind of a frank conversation around what's the forecast for local independent retail really? What's really possible for that? What's the role that independent retail can and should play in our communities given the online dynamics that are present and not going away? And not going to, in my opinion, and maybe it's just because I live in the same city as Amazon, I just don't see people pulling away from that approach just so that they can have a little bit better of a personal experience and get out of the house, to go down and visit the neighborhood retail store. So if there is a role to play, what is it, and how do we start working toward that so that it's something that's viable? And not just kind of banging our heads and trying to maintain an idea that may not be viable in the 21st century. I want to get real about that.
Well, thank you so much for your time today, Christine. You've been listening to the BALLE podcast, and our guest today has been Christine Hanna, co-director of the Seattle Good Business Network, an Economic Development Commissioner for the City of Seattle, and a 2013-2014 BALLE Local Economy Fellow. Christine, thanks again.
You're welcome, Andrew. It was fun.
We'll talk to you again real soon.